The summer sun hung low over the Montana plains, and Sarah Mitchell sat on the weathered bench outside the old barn, watching her granddaughter Emma chase butterflies through the tall grass. And she thought about how quickly time had passed and how precious these moments were. Her husband Tom had been gone 3 years now, and the ranch felt bigger somehow and emptier. Despite all the animals and the hired hands who came and went with the seasons, and she had learned to manage on her own. But there were days when the silence pressed down on her heart like a stone. Emma was 8 years old and full of questions and energy, and she reminded Sarah so much of her own daughter at that age. And Sarah's daughter lived in Seattle now with a busy job and a busier life, and Emma's visits were the bright spots that carried Sarah through the lonely stretches between seasons. "Grandma," Emma called out, running toward her with something cupped in her small hands. "Look what I found," Sarah leaned forward and saw a tiny injured sparrow nestled in Emma's palms, and its wing was bent at an odd angle, and it trembled with fear or pain or both. "Oh, sweetheart," Sarah said gently, "that little bird is hurt. Can we help it?" Emma asked, and her eyes were wide and hopeful, and Sarah recognized that look and that pure desire to fix what was broken and make the world right again. "We can try," Sarah said, standing up slowly because her knees weren't what they used to be, and she led Emma into the house where they found a small cardboard box and lined it with soft cloths. They settled the bird inside, and Emma watched it with such fierce concentration that Sarah had to smile, and she remembered being young and believing that love alone could heal anything. The phone rang, and it was Daniel Hawkins from the neighboring ranch, and his voice was rough and uncertain. "Sarah," he said, "I have a situation here, and I was wondering if you might have room in your barn." Daniel was a good man, and a widower like herself, and they had known each other for 40 years, and their children had played together when they were young, and life had brought them both full circle back to loneliness and land. "What kind of situation?" Sarah asked. "Took in a rescue horse," Daniel said, "but she's small and damaged, and my stable hands say she won't make it, and they want me to put her down. But I can't bring myself to do it, and I thought maybe you'd have a different perspective." Sarah looked at Emma, who was still watching the sparrow, and she thought about second chances and how everyone deserved at least one. "Bring her over," Sarah said. "We'll figure something out." An hour later, Daniel's truck pulled up the long driveway, and Sarah and Emma walked out to meet him. And when he lowered the trailer ramp, Sarah saw the horse and understood immediately why his men had given up. The mare was small and thin, and her coat was patchy and dull, and one of her legs had an old injury that had healed badly, and she stood in the trailer with her head low and her eyes empty of hope or fight. "Too small," one of Daniel's hands said, shaking his head. "She won't survive the winter, and even if she does, she's too damaged for any real work, and it's kinder to let her go now." But Sarah walked up to the trailer and spoke softly to the horse and reached out her hand, and the mare lifted her head just slightly and looked at Sarah with those deep dark eyes, and something passed between them that Sarah couldn't explain. "Will she fit in with your other horses?" Daniel asked quietly, and there was something in his voice that suggested he was asking about more than just the mare. Sarah looked at the small, damaged creature, and then at Emma, who was watching with that same fierce hope she'd shown with the sparrow, and Sarah thought about her own life, and how she'd felt too small and too broken after Tom died, and how she'd wondered if she would fit anywhere anymore. "She'll fit just fine," Sarah said softly. Daniel's face relaxed, and he nodded, and together they led the mare into Sarah's barn and settled her in a stall away from the other horses where she could have peace and quiet and time to heal. Emma named her Hope, and Sarah didn't object, even though she usually didn't let people name the animals because names made everything harder when the time came to let go. But maybe that was the point, and maybe letting go was only hard when you'd held on to something that mattered. The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm, and Emma spent hours sitting by Hope's stall, talking to her and reading to her and brushing her coat with patient strokes, and Sarah watched her granddaughter pour love into this broken creature, and she saw the mare begin to respond. Hope started eating more, and her coat began to shine, and the emptiness in her eyes gradually filled with something like trust, and Sarah realized that healing wasn't always about fixing what was broken, but about creating space for something new to grow. Daniel started coming by more often, and at first he said it was to check on Hope, but soon he was staying for coffee and conversation, and Sarah found herself looking forward to his visits and to the sound of another voice in the house. They talked about everything and nothing, and about their children and their lost spouses and the weight of memories and the fear of forgetting and the fear of never moving forward. "Do you ever feel too old for this?" Daniel asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the plains. "For what?" Sarah asked. "For starting over," he said. "For trying to fit into a life that feels different from everything you knew." Sarah thought about Hope and about Emma and about the sparrow that had healed enough to fly away just yesterday. And Emma had cried but also smiled and said she was glad it was free. "I think we're never too old to try," Sarah said. "And I think starting over doesn't mean forgetting what came before, and it just means making room for what comes next." Daniel nodded and reached over and took her hand, and his grip was warm and steady and familiar and new. All at once, Emma's visit came to an end as summer turned to fall, and Sarah drove her to the airport, and Emma hugged her tight and whispered, "Take care of Hope for me." "I will," Sarah promised, "and you take care of that big heart of yours." After Emma left, the ranch felt quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, and not the pressing silence that Sarah had known before. And Hope was there and Daniel was there. And Sarah was learning that family wasn't just about blood, but about who showed up and who stayed. The winter came cold and hard, and Sarah worried about Hope, but the little mare proved tougher than anyone expected, and she survived and even thrived. And by spring she was strong enough to be turned out with the other horses. Sarah watched nervously that first day, wondering if Hope would be rejected or hurt, but the other horses sniffed her cautiously and then simply accepted her, and Hope ran with them across the pasture. And her gait was awkward because of her old injury, but she ran anyway, and Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. Daniel came up behind her and put his hand on her shoulder and said, "You were right, and she fit just fine." "So did you," Sarah said, turning to look at him. He smiled, and it was the first real smile she'd seen from him in all the years since his wife had passed, and she knew it was probably the first real smile she'd given too. They were married that summer in a small ceremony on the ranch, and Emma was the flower girl, and Hope wore ribbons in her mane, and it felt right and whole, and like the pieces of different puzzles coming together to make something new and beautiful. Sarah thought about all the broken things she'd seen in her life, and all the people who'd been told they were too small, or too damaged, or too old, and she thought about how wrong those voices had been. Because fitting in wasn't about being perfect, and it was about finding the place where your particular shape of broken matched someone else's particular shape of broken. And together, you made something stronger than either of you could be alone. Emma called that night from Seattle, and Sarah told her about the wedding, and Emma squealed with delight and said, "I knew it. Grandma and I knew Hope would help you be happy again." "She did," Sarah said, "and so did you, sweetheart." Years passed, and the ranch continued its rhythms, and Hope lived a long and peaceful life and became something of a legend among the local horse community, and people would bring their damaged and rejected animals to Sarah, and she always found room. Daniel liked to joke that their barn was becoming a sanctuary for misfits, and Sarah would laugh and say that maybe the whole world should be a sanctuary for misfits because everyone deserved a place to belong on her 70th birthday. Sarah stood in the pasture with Daniel beside her, and they watched the sun rise over the Montana plains, and the horses grazed peacefully, and the barn cats wound around their legs, and somewhere in the house the old dog was probably sleeping on the couch. "Do you have any regrets?" Daniel asked. Sarah thought about Tom, and about the years she'd spent alone, and about all the small moments of doubt and fear, and wondering if she was too broken to ever be whole again. "No," she said finally, "because everything that broke me also taught me how to heal, and everything I lost made room for what I found." Daniel kissed her forehead, and they stood there together watching the light spread across the land, and Sarah remembered that day when he'd brought Hope to her and asked if she would fit. She thought about how that question had really been about both of them, and about whether two broken people could fit together into something resembling wholeness, and the answer had been yes, and would always be. Yes, because the beautiful truth that Sarah had learned was that nothing was ever too small or too damaged or too old to deserve love and care, and a second chance. And fitting in didn't mean changing yourself to match some impossible standard.